Right,
Very
now
good.
we're here on Barrack Street. Behind me is the Roman Catholic Cathedral, Cathedral of the Holy Trinity. And in many ways it symbolises the changing nature of the church, politics and power throughout Waterford's history. In the 16th century, the Catholic Church lost all power and influence due to a state-sponsored Reformation run from England. So it went underground, what's known as the penal laws, and there was no infrastructure at all. That continued for about 200 years. And then the building of this cathedral marks the great change, not just in Irish history, but actually in European history too. Because for the 200 years before it was built, religious persecution was common and widespread all over Europe. Catholics, Protestants, Muslims and Jews, they all suffered religious persecution under different regimes in Europe. Typically in Europe at the time, in most countries, anything from about 4% to around 12% of the population of each country were victims of religious persecution. That was commonplace. What made Ireland so distinctively different, Ireland was the only country in Europe where religious persecution happened the majority. 80% of the Irish were Catholic, but for centuries they had very few rights. But in practice it worked out differently. Even the most stupid English bureaucrat in Dublin Castle soon learned that if you exclude 80% of the population from all economic and all political and social activities, the society and the economy won't work. So what happened in practice was, when England enjoyed periods of peace with the neighbours, France, Spain, and there was no threats of rebellions in Ireland or Scotland, they relaxed the penal laws. They stayed on the statute books, but they weren't officially applied fully. And then when England came under threat, they applied them again. So it was periodic repression. The first big official change in policy had to wait until early in 1793, the spring of 1793. And from the spring of 1793, Catholics in Ireland were allowed to build churches again, officially. And the reason for this sudden and dramatic change, the rising threat of the French Revolution. Once the French Revolution took hold in Europe, it changed the whole political ballgame. And for the first time in centuries, the Pope in Rome and the King in England were now suddenly on the same side of the argument. They still hated each other's guts, but they feared the French Revolution so much they were willing to patch up a compromise deal. And part of the deal allowed Catholics here the right to build churches. Work started in this cathedral 3 weeks later. It took 3 years to build it, completed by 1796. The architect was the famous local architect John Roberts, and the money to build it came from the Waterford emigre community in Cadiz, in Spain. They sent home the cash. This cathedral is unique in Ireland for several reasons. Number one, it's the oldest Catholic cathedral in Ireland. Secondly, this is the only Catholic cathedral in Ireland or Britain to be built in the 18th century. Thirdly, it's the only cathedral in Ireland which is Baroque in architectural style. It's modelled on the church architecture of Central Europe. And fourthly, Waterford is the only city in Europe where both Catholic and Protestant, the two cathedrals, were built by the same man, John Roberts. But the facade we see today is not original. For the first 100 years of its existence, nobody saw the cathedral from this angle. There was a terrace of houses down the front, and the Catholics weren't allowed to have a frontage on the public street back in 1793. But in the 1880s, the diocese purchased 5 houses at the front, demolished them, and then put on this brand new facade for the first centenary, 1893. If you see this facade, what does it remind you of? It reminds you of St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican in Rome. And this is the 1890s. The Catholic Church has now achieved complete power in Ireland. But for 100 years earlier, they had no church at all. An intervening century, when they didn't have this entrance, the entrance to the cathedral was down the little narrow lane here at Cathedral Lane. That was the original entrance to the church.
What's the name? Luke Watting.
Luke Watting was probably Waterford's most influential man internationally. He was born to the Catholic elite in 1588 here in Waterford. The Wattings and the Wises and the Whites, these families had been dominating Waterford politics and society and economics for centuries. But it was a time of great change. The Whites and the Wattings and the Wises, who had been in power for so long, were now under pressure. The British government under Queen Elizabeth was basically systematically excluding Catholics from power, from wealth, from economic activity. At this stage, Luke was born in the 1580s. He moved to Spain as a young boy, became a priest, went on to become a professor of theology at Salamanca, and at 25 was appointed by the Spanish Empire, which was at the time were the world's #1 superpower, as their ambassador to Rome. Now, that's a really high-profile position, and he remained the Spanish ambassador to Rome for the rest of his days. But that was just the day job, the official job. His real role was much more interesting. Luke Wadding was basically the organiser in Europe of an education system for Catholics in the Irish colleges and seminaries, which stretched from Warsaw in the east through Prague to Leuven in Belgium and down into Spain and Italy, all the Catholic countries, and these Irish colleges providing a third level education for the Irish in Europe when no education was allowed at home. And not only set up the colleges, he also organised the finances to keep them going for centuries through the Irish merchant classes in Europe, endowments, and the Irish regiments in the various armies who contributed money. And that's unique in world history. That's the only case ever where a people without a state or without an infrastructure organised third level education in another country for displaced people. He's also a prolific scholar, wrote many books, and he was the man actually who fixed St. Patrick's Day for March 17th on the evidence that that was the day that the saint would have died. And in 1646, Luke Wadding was the only Irishman ever who was a shortlisted candidate to be Pope. But he didn't get elected. They probably reckon he was too young. He was only about 58 at the time. So, surprise, surprise, they gave the job to an Italian. And Luke was special advisor to the new Pope. And he was kind of, let's say, Bookie's favourite to be the next Pope. But he died in 1657, just before the Pope did. So he never got the top job. I gotta go. Just as Catholics were being repressed in Ireland, in France and in Spain, Protestants, Jews and Muslims were being oppressed. In the French example, the French Protestants were known as the Huguenots. And there was a long and bloody series of civil wars in France in the 16th century to try and get Protestants recognition and rights to worship and all that. And eventually they worked it out in a kind of a compromise called the Edict of Nantes. The Edict of Nantes said basically French Protestants can practice their religion and do so quietly, and they can have toleration, but don't do so publicly and don't deny the Catholics basically. So it was a kind of a live and let live compromise. That held until 1686, well over a century. And then the new French King Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes. So he withdrew the privileges and the rights and the tolerations, and there followed a bloody pogrom against Protestants in France. And the Protestants, many were killed. Many of them also left and fled as Huguenots. The most significant numbers went to places like Holland. A lot of them went to Berlin, actually. A lot of them went to South Africa. Some came to Ireland, some came to Britain. They settled in Waterford in the late 1680s as refugees, and they quickly integrated into the business and commercial life of Waterford. But they did maintain their own religious identity. For about a century, they worshipped in the part of Greyfriars known as the French Church down in Bailey's New Street. And that's what they called the French Church. They worshipped in the French language there. They brought to Waterford expertise. They brought to Waterford overseas commercial contacts. And Waterford, within 25 years, was a major supplier of salted beef to the French Navy based in Bordeaux. Many of the Waterford Quakers, or sorry, not Quakers, Huguenots, originated around the west of France in La Rochelle, and the other ones came primarily from Provence in the south of France. And they reputedly brought to Waterford the French bread, which became known as the blas. So we can thank maybe the French Huguenots for that little item of local cuisine. Gotta go, lads. See you.
Thanks,
Jack.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.